It's Monday, and that's what happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure that you can catch each Wednesday morning at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. This week's movie is kind of an interesting one. Not only does it go way back to the earliest days of synchronized sound films, not only is it another Carl Laemmle produced Universal Pictures film, not only does it return to the era of German Expressionism, not only does it bring back the star of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Conrad Veidt, not only does it inspire one of the most famous pop culture comic book villains of all time, but it's also a romantic melodrama more in the style of The Hunchback of Notre Dame and The Phantom of the Opera than a typical quote-unquote monster movie. This week, I'm looking at 1928's The Man Who Laughs. Now, I said that this goes back to the earliest days of synchronized sound films. Let it be known that this movie was actually filmed as a silent film. It was not filmed like the very popular Jazz Singer, which was able to basically synchronize sound with film. The Man Who Laughs initially premiered as a typical silent film with the orchestra or something playing along with it inside the theater. But later, it did get a synchronized soundtrack added to the film in later more wide release throughout the year of 1928. But the film comes from director Paul Lenny. Now, he was born in Stuttgart in the German Empire in 1885 and began directing films in Germany as early as 1917. However, he actually got his start in the motion picture business in 1913 as an art director. While he had a pretty decent number of films that he worked on, he was brought over to the United States and made 4 films with Universal Pictures. The Cat and the Canary and The Chinese Parrot were both released in 1927. The Man Who Laughs was 1928, and The Last Warning in 1929. Sadly, he died very young. He was only 44 when he passed on September 2nd, 1929. He turned out he had an untreated tooth infection that led to sepsis, which ultimately took his life. Now, I mentioned previously this is more in the vein of Hunchback of Notre Dame. Well, that's not an accident. The Man Who Laughs was one of the final prose fiction novels of French writer Victor Hugo. Now, Hugo's other 2 very popular books that also get lots of adaptations throughout the decades were Les Miserables and, of course, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Les Mis was actually published when he was in political exile after Napoleon III rose to power. While Hugo was an elected conservative, he would often split with them on major topics. He wanted the French to live and lead happy lives free from poverty and misery. He wanted universal suffrage and free education. He was also quite popular for wanting to get rid of the death penalty in the mid-1850s. He's a fairly interesting character in terms of a political person and a writer. Now, billed first for this film is Mary Philbin. Now, we've seen her previously. She was Christine, the object of the affections of Lon Chaney's The Phantom of the Opera. Philbin was a contract player at Universal, and Erich von Stroheim referred to her as a Universal super jewel, as she appeared in several of the studio's highest profile films. Now, while her movies across her career were pretty high profile, by far and away her most celebrated role was in The Phantom of the Opera. Philbin was really only a star of the silent era. She appeared in only a couple of talkies, but she did famously dub her own character when The Phantom of the Opera was given a sound release at the end of the 20s. In 1930, Philbin retired from making films. She actually has a pretty famous heartbreak story. In 1923, Erich von Stroheim introduced her to talent agent Paul Kohner. The two secretly got engaged in 1926, but they actually never married. Kohner was Jewish and Philbin was raised in a staunchly Catholic family. With both sides unwilling to convert for the other, Philbin and Kohner would separate, never to marry. Philbin never married anyone after their relationship ended. Kohner ended up marrying Lapita Tovar a few years later. But later, when Conrad died in the late 80s, it was discovered that he still had in his possession all of the love letters that Mary Philbin wrote to him throughout, in the time that they were together. And she still possessed all the ones that he sent her. And it was said that she was terribly heartbroken when he died. She spent almost her entire 63 years of retirement as a recluse in Los Angeles. Like I said, she never married, and she very, very rarely made public appearances of any kind, except for one. She did attend the Los Angeles premiere of Andrew Lloyd Webber's The Phantom of the Opera. She died aged 90 of pneumonia. And as I also said, Conrad Veidt is back in this. After playing Caesar in the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, he would make several films in Germany. Prior to The Man Who Laughs, Veidt worked with Paul Linney on the 1924 film Waxwork. But once the Nazis seized power in Germany in 1933, and when Joseph Goebbels began purging the film industry of dissidents and Jews, Veidt left for the United States by way of Britain. Veidt, a non-Jew, was fiercely opposed to anti-Semitism and was very much against Nazi ideology. He was married to a Jewish woman, whom he actually married just before splitting for England in 1933. Now, before coming to America, Veidt gave a huge portion of his life savings to the United Kingdom's government to help them in the fight against Germany in World War II. And upon arriving in the United States, he worked hard to be in films in which, if he must be cast as a Nazi, he had to be cast as a villain. It was in his contract. And that was in order to help convince the still isolationist populace that the American forces needed to join the British and the Soviets in the war against Germany. Interestingly, the final film to be released before Veidt died of a heart attack in 1943 was Casablanca. Veidt is commonly listed fifth in the credits, but at the time, he was such a popular actor, particularly for playing villainous Nazis and other villainous German characters. He was actually the highest paid actor in the film, despite Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman starring in this picture, both of which considered, well, Humphrey Bogart was one of the biggest stars of the 40s, and Bergman is considered to this day one of the greatest actresses to have ever lived. Now, you probably want me to kind of go back to that thing I said about this movie serving as an inspiration for one of the most famous pop culture comic book villains ever, right? Well, you got it, listeners. Conrad Veidt's disfigured, wide smile he wore as Gwynplaine, along with his long face and combed back hair, served as the inspiration for Bill Finger, Jerry Robinson, and Bob Kane to create the Joker at DC Comics. Now, if you see a picture of Gwynplaine and when he is not hiding his grotesque mouth, and if you didn't know anything about this movie, you'd think that this would be kind of one of those mock-ups that people do of a Joker or Batman movie made in the 20s before they even first appeared. Like if this was envisioned as a silent movie instead of as a comic book, that sort of thing. And if someone was to say that Veidt's appearance was not the inspiration for this character, you wouldn't believe them for a second. That's how close the look is. And down through the decades, some artists even lean into that visage even more. There is even a character who is a twisted version of Batman that's kind of more or less a half Batman, half Joker in terms of personality and insanity, called the Batman Who Laughs. And that only ties that inspiration even closer to the Bat family of characters at the publisher. Now, the movie begins in 17th century England. King James II is sleeping peacefully when his court jester enters His Majesty's bedroom to announce the capture of a nobleman who was in exile named Lord Clancharlie. Now, Lord Clancharlie is also played by Veidt, as he is the father of Gwynplaine. The exiled lord only returned to England to find his son because he feared the king has done something horrible to him. But James confirms that Gwynplaine is alive and well, but a grin has been carved into the kid's face so that he may forever laugh at the fool that was his father. Lord Clancharlie is then sent to the Iron Lady, where he dies an excruciating death. So we learn a bit more about who it was that took Gwynplaine and carved that smile onto his face. This was the work of the Comprachicos, who were labeled as gypsy criminals who traded in stolen children. Now, their surgeon, Harquinone, would carve smiles into the children that they bought or stole to turn them into basically twisted clowns, jesters, jokers, other sideshow type characters. The king banished all the Comprachicos from England, and when they set sail as to not be caught and convicted of additional crimes, there is one who does not board the ship. In fact, they actually push him away to prevent him from boarding the ship. Yes, Gwynplaine is left behind, and he's left to wander the snow-covered terrain where he finds a homeless woman frozen to death holding her still living baby. Realizing the mother is dead, Gwynplaine takes the child and seeks shelter for himself and the baby, and eventually he comes across the home of a kindly older philosopher named Ursus, who gives him shelter and something to eat. And Ursus discovers the baby is blind and is actually horrified to see Gwynplaine has a smile carved upon his face as a victim of Comprachicos. Now, years pass and Ursus and Gwynplaine are successful in business together, and Gwynplaine is known throughout the land as the Laughing Man. The baby, Dia, grows up and is in love with her savior, Gwynplaine. It is true that Ursus sells the Laughing Man as an unfortunate abandoned child of the Comprachicos, but is now beloved as the Laughing Man. However, Gwynplaine must always be comforted by Dia, because he is deeply ashamed of how he looks, believing himself unworthy of even her love. He even covers his mouth when she feels around his face to hide the fact that he has that smile cut into his into his face. So he's pretty down on himself. Now, Harquinone discovers that Ursus has one of his former patients at the Southwark Fair, and he sends a message along to the Duchess, who now possesses all of Lord Clancharlie's land and wealth, that he knows there's a living heir, and if she doesn't pay him for silence, well, he'll go public and to the Queen, and she'll be outed as a pretender, or whatever it would be called in this scenario. Now, there's a scandal brewing here, and this is all kicked off by that letter sent from Harquinone. Now, the Duchess does not live up to her duties as part of the court of Queen Anne, who is currently on the throne of England. Her absence in the court angers the Queen, so knowing that she's upset, it turns out that the jester, who was once employed by King James II, Barkilphedro, is now a high-ranking agent of the court, and he intercepts the letter and uses it for his own gain with the Queen. Not only that, but you see that the Duchess Josiana is not just derelict in her duties as a member of the court. She takes nothing seriously. She teases and cavorts with other men, but betrothed to the goofy-looking Lord Durimoir. And she goes to the fair instead of a hoity-toity concert with the rest of the royal court. Later, she does attend one of Gwynplaine's performances, and as she watches, she is simultaneously sexually aroused and repulsed by the Laughing Man. So she sends a message to Gwynplaine inviting him to her estate, where she attempts to seduce the clown. This only adds more pain to Gwynplaine's already fairly tortured existence, as he's in love with Dia, but did indeed find that the Duchess is rather attractive. He especially finds that she did not once laugh like the rest of the audience did at his performance. Not to mention, her note did read that the cause for her not laughing might just be out of love. And since Dia cannot see his face, it's kind of attractive to him that the woman who did see his face may yet actually love him. Unfortunately, not only does Dia hear him leave, but she also discovers the note the Duchess sent him, and it does smell of perfume that a woman would wear. When he arrives at Josiana's estate, he is almost repulsed by her attempts to seduce him. He doesn't know how to accept her advances when he's not sure how he feels about his own appearance. Even Josiana, upon pulling down the covering over his smile, is still initially repulsed, but then is overcome with her own sexual desire. Now, while she tries the sex on Gwynplaine, she receives what appears to be an official notice from the Queen that her estate now belongs to Gwynplaine and that the Queen has decreed that she is to marry him and not Lord Fancy Pants or whatever his name was. And finally, at this point, Josiana has a good laugh. Now, when Gwynplaine returns home, he finds Dia sleeping outside with the note from Josiana clutched in her hand. But she's happy to know that he's returned, and for the first time, she allows him to touch all of his face, including his smile. She cries tears of joy knowing that she finally sees him, but was always happy to have known him for who he really was, saying that God blinded her so that she may know who he actually is, instead of not seeing him first and then having to struggle to get to know him. Now, Gwynplaine, transversely, is happy to know the woman he truly loves him back. But unfortunately, guards arrive to arrest Gwynplaine. Ursus follows to try to figure out what's going on and tells the rest of the clowns in his show to make sure that Dia knows nothing of what has transpired. So, the prison that Gwynplaine is put into is fabled to basically be a place people don't come out of alive. And waiting outside to find out what happened to his adopted son, Ursus sees a coffin being hauled out and believes that Gwynplaine was executed for whatever crime he was supposedly guilty of. In fact, it was the coffin of the arrested Harquanone, who was picked up to be removed from the playing field by the always scheming Barkilphedro. Now, Gwynplaine is released from prison to be made a member of the House of Lords. Now, I'll admit, I'm not entirely sure what this whole scheme is about. It's a little convoluted in the story. I think there is this kind of elaborate scheme to ultimately mock and destroy Gwynplaine by first making him a lowly clown a lord, and then for Dia to possibly be present for the Queen to decree that he must marry Josiana. I'm not entirely sure. There's a lot of double, triple, quadruple crossing going on here. But I do know that Ursus and the rest of his troop try to carry on that there is nothing wrong, but eventually Dia does overhear that Gwynplaine has died when Barkilphedro tells Ursus that it is official that Gwynplaine was executed or died in prison. What's more, Ursus and Dia are banished from England for whatever reason, and they have to leave first thing the next morning. The confirmation of Gwynplaine as the new Lord Clancharlie turns into a debacle as he is mercilessly mocked. In addition, Dia is also kind of badly tricked and mocked by Barkilphedro, but everyone gets theirs in the end. First, Gwynplaine protests the Queen's decree for Josiana's hand in marriage. The lords protest in return, saying that he should be grateful for being made a lord. But he says that a king made him a clown, a queen made him a lord, but first, God made him a man, and he rejects his lordship and plans to return to his original life. And he escapes into the streets where the guards chase him. He runs through the streets, and the crowd that he runs through as he runs through the streets is pleased to find out that their beloved Laughing Man has returned. So they begin following him, and he learns about Ursus and Dia's banishment while the people fight off the Queen's guards and Barkilphedro as well, allowing Gwynplaine to escape to the docks. Now, Barkilphedro is ultimately done in for when the loyal dog of Ursus and Dia mauls him to death when he attempts to follow Gwynplaine, rowing a small boat out to the ship to be reunited with Ursus and Dia. Now, Gwynplaine, Dia, and Ursus all sail away happy to be together again. So let's talk about the three things I like about The Man Who Laughs. First up, the early stuff with the younger Gwynplaine is really pretty dark. I mean, geez, the kid has been butchered and forever scarred. Then, just to twist that knife, he's basically left to die in a snowstorm. I didn't even mention this, but I'm not even sure the kid has shoes. So he has to discover a dead woman and then decides to take on a baby. It's all fairly dark stuff, and it's also pretty good at making sure that the character who is disfigured is never once looked at as the bad guy here. He may look like something you would think of as a monster, but he's actually more of a victim. There are definitely other monsters in this story, particularly from the government, which Victor Hugo kind of his at times anti-government stance, depending on who's in power or what they're trying to push, kind of makes sense in the long run. But he's good to save Dia, and he's celebrated, not feared or hated. I like that there's a great deal of care put into his backstory to ensure that you understand his loneliness and unfortunate origins. Next, and while this is also kind of a confusing part of the story, there is a large portion of this movie that is kind of sewn into the overall story of Gwynplaine that is about political scandal. It's interesting how much this is kind of sort of timeless in a way. What's more, I mentioned how dark the earlier scenes were. Well, that owes a great deal to this being pre-code era. The Hays Code not being in effect allowed for them to really kind of, really kind of helps with like the activities and the attitude on display of Duchess Josiana. Now, she's played by Russian actress Olga Baklanova. She was mostly cast as vixens and exotic temptresses. Sorry, I'm getting stumbling over my words here. But throughout her career, that's what she typically played. The first time we see her in this movie, she's getting into a bath. And we don't see much of anything, but we see more than we typically would expect in, before the current day rating system went into effect in the 60s. Everything about her is sexual. Harquinon's messenger is trying to catch more of a look at her through a keyhole. When she gets out of the bath, she barely covers up and basically uses her charms to kind of tease the former jester that now works for the Queen's court. She even wants him to kiss her feet, but ultimately pushes him away. She's just a giant tease, and when she gets to the fair, she quickly picks up an entourage, and they are kind of grabbing at her top and nearly causing her to have a wardrobe malfunction. Her fiancé, the goofy-looking guy, the Deary Moir, or whatever his name is a comically goofy and foppish-looking guy that you would almost typically see as a butt of a joke in something like a Mel Brooks movie. There are petty rivalries within the Queen's court. The Duchess is more concerned about hearing the rumors and gossip than she is interested in doing whatever her job is. It's this whole chunk of this actual story that provides a kind of seriousness to the story, right? It's not just about a disfigured guy who entertains and possibly frightens people. It's really not that at all. Instead, it's a real comedy drama that includes a great deal of political maneuvering and parody of political figures. Lastly, Conrad Veidt is really good in this movie. He has to do a whole lot of acting without his mouth, which is permanently frozen in a smile. So in order to express emotion, he has to do a lot of other physical acting. And if we talk about whole body acting, for one, he is playing a classic clown type character. So he does have some whole body physical acting to do anyway. His lithe form is what you would think of as a court jester or clown from over 300 years ago. It's a lot of angular posturing and work. Being that the voice acting is not present in this film, it's a lot of exaggerated movements too. And that means to really portray how he is truly feeling, Veidt has to do it all with his eyes. However, while he is supposed to be disfigured and thought of as quote unquote ugly or grotesque, Veidt shines a great deal of warmth and friendliness through his eyes. You are compelled to sympathize with him and maybe even feel a great deal of empathy for him. In the end, the story is about him kind of accepting who he is. He doesn't need to be a lord. He can be happy being a clown, even if he never understood before that people loved him and weren't laughing at him. There's a big difference between the common folk laughing because he is truly entertaining them and the royalty of the House of Lords laughing almost in spite that he is a lowly clown. He was a hero of the people because he could help them forget their struggles and worries. Veidt does a wonderful job in this movie showing that he is struggling with himself and his relationship with Dia, and no matter that, you're basically seeing him with this disfigurement that was forced upon him as a child, you like him. So you want him to feel good about who he is, and Veidt never once slips up and makes him creepy or scary. It's a marvelous physical performance. Well, that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast on Wednesdays and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers. And we also upload the episodes to YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new review articles every Friday morning. Next time, we stick with the Universal Pictures films for June and start digging into more sequels from the Universal Classic Monster cycle with 1942's Invisible Agent. Until next week, stay spooky.